Actually, I'm not sorry.
What is a reading culture in a place that has about 60% unemployment? What is a reading culture in darkness? What is a reading culture in poverty? Hey quiz, Letlhogonolo here, and this is for the culture. I'm good, how are you? Okay, but all these bits and pieces. I was a really lonely queer, and books became my first friend because it was a world that I could get absorbed in. It started as a way to stop the loneliness, but it soon became something that formed part of my life. I can't imagine myself not reading. Now it's kind of like a secret love affair because I'm gonna read 3 books this week and it's gonna change my life. One of the books that I think profoundly changed my life is All About Love by Bell Hooks. It just sort of makes sense. I lost my mom a couple of years ago, and I was really struggling with grief, right? I'm really struggling with this, how do I contain this, what's happening? And Bell Hooks in All About Love has a chapter on loss. And she says we need to think of death is so hard because of love. And she says that we need to think of grief as mourning and celebration. And that kind of freed me, right? It made me not feel bad about the fact that I'm mourning people who are alive and people who have died because I love them. And, they've left and there's just some absence in my life because of these people. And then Salvation, Black People and Love, which is kind of the second book in this love trilogy by Bell Hooks, is also a book that I recommend. In Salvation, Bell says, for Black people, love is a crucial path to healing. And not love in a romantic or friendship sense. She's just saying love is an ethic of doing politics, right? If you love queer people, you're going to advocate for them, right? If you like Black people, you're going to advocate for them. So love is part of our politic. I think I just cultivated that love, but then I was nobody's having conversations about queer people and the books that queer people should be reading or the writers that queer people should know or people should know that are queer. And so Alma and myself a couple of years ago started The Cheeky Natives, which is a literary podcast. And the first time we met, because we met through a mutual friend, we literally started talking about books. And so our friendship then became we would call each other every other 2 days. She'd be oh my gosh, let me tell you about this, right? And so we then began to go to book launches. And at book launches, it felt like we were having a conversation with the author. And people came up to us afterwards to be where can we listen to you? Do you guys have a radio show? We're no, we don't. We're just here, we just read. And I suppose then what happened is, and I saw a gap in the market. We were nobody's really talking about books written by Black people, for Black people, by Black people, about Black people. So let's start a podcast. And we're okay, what are we gonna call it? What are we gonna call it? So we call it The Cheeky Natives, right? And the whole idea is it's a reclamation in many instances because when they call us clever Blacks or the Blacks that can read, and so we were and they used to call, you think about Miriam Tladi, for instance, right, who is the second Black woman in South Africa to write a novel in English, right, because Bessie Head was the first, but she moved out of South Africa to live in Botswana. So we kind of put Miriam Tladi as the first Black woman, right? So Miriam Tladi writes this book, and it's called Miriam at Metropolitan, and in it she speaks about how they refer to Black people as cheeky, right? These Black people who have mouths, right? And so we're let's be that. We are reclaiming a space that wasn't created for us, so we need to be the cheeky. And we are natives in our land, so we need to be natives, right? And it sounds so nice, the cheeky natives, right? And so we started this podcast, right? Initially, it was going to be Alma and I over coffee, and we were just going to talk about books. And then we're wait, hold on. What if we bring the author? and we brought the authors. For me, I think it was really important for Alma and I to sit down and say, we want to give people something that they are not getting anywhere else. So the level of depth in the preparation of the interviews that we have with our authors is really a care that we have for the work, right? Like for me, it's like I love reading and I want to be able to tell the person who's written the book that I enjoyed your book this much that I even want to ask about that weird sentence in the middle. One of the first author interviews we had, like luckily, was Mohale Mashego to talk about the yearning. And literally we went on Twitter and we're like, listen, we know you're in Joburg. We would love to talk to you about your book. And obviously it's like those shoot your shot type of things. And she came and we had like a live audience and recorded this podcast. And it was just like stunning. Yeah, I loved the fact that like we can connect people through books in this way. Like, often people who listen to our podcast say, I had the same question. I'm so glad you asked it because I was confused too. And it kind of is nice to know that like it's a solitary experience reading, but it's also not because it's communal, because you'll come together and speak about like books and what made you mad, what made you sad, and those type of things. So yeah, that's the Cheeky Natives.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. Yo, this has been...
What it do, though?
Yeah.
I mean, firstly,
awesome.
We also have to say, now I'm sitting in the presence of greatness because we have an alum of the Yali Fellowship.
Yeah.
And Alma will be heading off to the US of A to do the same program.
Yay.
So, okay, Yali people.
Yali rocks.
Yes.
When we started our podcast, one of the things that Alma and I were talking about is that it's not that there aren't Black writers, it's that people don't know Black writers, right? So you think about, for instance, the year after we started our podcast, or the year we started our podcast, the year before, Mohale Mashego had released her first novel, The Yearning, right? And The Yearning kind of opened up this conversation about like the potential of African writing, right? And I'm not saying that no one was writing before her, but for us, like that was one of the books that was a catalyst for us to begin to think about literature more seriously. And then you think about like the number of writers that have been on the podcast, for instance, right? You'd think of Ashley Makwe, for instance, who wrote a chapbook about poetry. So we also begin to introduce writers who people wouldn't ordinarily know because like they are kind of on the outskirts in the true sense of the word. They aren't at the front of the bookstore. They are kind of shift somewhere. And so I think it's shifted in a way that like people, begin to take their writings more seriously because they think, oh, there are people who are talking about books, right? And I think also more and more writers are saying, I think my story is worth telling, so I'm going to tell it. And so for me, it's like, I'm so glad there's like this plethora of writings, right? And like the Cheeky Natives cannot grab every single person, but we are able to grab a few people and say, hey, do you know a book called They Called Me Queer, for instance? Like, are you, is that something that you're into, like those type of things? What has happened since we began our podcast is that you're seeing more and more writers, but also more writers who are invested in conversations about their books. I find that before you just saw a 250-page review in a newspaper and then that was it. Now you have like an hour and a bit of like people talking about books that you can listen at your convenience. You can pause and start and pause. But I also think that there isn't enough of it happening. I'm kind of like, we haven't gotten to a point where we're just like, there are so many books. I'm spoiled for choice. It's kind of like you can count the number of books that are being published in a year by Black writers, particularly. So I just want to start at the beginning. Obviously, your book is called Becoming Him, a trans memoir of triumph, right? I think that you chose those words particularly, a trans memoir of triumph. So tell us about the title of the book and how it came about.
So the title of the book actually came much, much, much later. Going through the manuscripts, reading and rereading this book, the resounding theme was always being able to come out of any sort of situation that life threw at me, especially my time in PE as a child.
We need to be very honest. The South African kind of culture is not for robustness and for depth, right? So it's really hard to run a literary podcast that focuses on literature and asks the really difficult question in a space that would rather enjoy a funny TikTok or mang mang being dragged and mang mang stitaba being put where. So the challenges are you are existing in a place that doesn't want you to exist, because essentially it's like a mirror. You're asking people to confront themselves when you're speaking about these books. And so the challenges are, one, that there's a risk that people just won't listen to the podcast, right? Or 5 people will listen to the podcast. The other challenge is that because we're unapologetically Black, like often that scares some publishers and some people off to be like, but we really want you to read this book because it's good. We're like, yeah, it's good. But white people have had a platform. They have a platform. We are saying that Black people historically and currently do not have the platform. Do not have people who are writing about or speaking about their books in the way that we would like to. And so we want to create that space. And that is challenging because people may not just give us books because they'll be like, oh, those are the Black ones. Oh my gosh, they're only for Black people. Why? And Black people aren't that great at writing anyway, So those are some of the challenges. And I think the other challenges is just not being recognized, right? I think often there are a number of literary events that have happened that the Cheeky Natives has not been invited. And you're like, why, right? But we're going to go mad if we detain ourselves with why, right? Like oftentimes I think like maybe the Cheeky Natives is a way before its time. We are doing in-depth work in a place that maybe isn't ready for in-depth work. And we are creating a mirror to a society and saying like, yes, you do say you're a rainbow nation and you do say that you see Black people, but do you really? Because why are you not engaging with the interior lives of Black people in the way that you're supposed to? Also the fatigue, right? Like you keep doing this thankless work in many instances, right? And thankless because like nobody's paying us to read these books and sit with these people, right? I mean, publishers have begun to do that. That's really nice. But nobody's really paying us to like write and think and all of those right things. But for me, again, what offsets kind of the challenges is that I, personally me, because I've got to live my wildest literary dreams. I've been in conversation with Sadia Hartman, like me, just this little queer person from Kimberley, sitting with Sadia Hartman. I've spoken to Carmen Machado, like I've spoken to Robert, now I've lived my wildest literary dreams. So in many instances, it's like, I think about that and I'm like, wait, but you get to live your best life. So maybe that should be the reward, right? Like that you are living your best life, as opposed to like this waiting for outward external validation. And we first became like a kind of podcast that speaks about books to becoming a literary platform that does more than just podcasting. We also now host virtual book events. We've been to book festivals, and like recently, I was one of the judging panel for the AKO Caine Prize 2020. And that's like all because of this little project, this little baby called the Cheeky Natives. I will tell you what the director of the Caine Prize said in choosing me. She said, you have an ability to read books in the way that I don't think many people do, like that you see the interior of a story. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know that. I'm just reading, And she said, and I think it's important to have someone like that in this year's cohort. We want to be very different about the Caine Prize. And I was like, are you certain? Me? Like, are there no other people, right? And so I'm sharing this because I think that I personally have been really bad with myself, right? So I've discounted myself from a lot of things. And Caine Prize was one of that, right? I could not for a moment believe that Letlhogonolo was worthy to judge a prize. A literary prize at that. Like, how dare I? Like, there's so many other people who could do that, right? But I think what the Caine Prize also did was like, the work is seen by the people it's supposed to be seen by. right? And the work is important for the people who it's important for, right? Do you know, like, I was stopped in the streets of London by people who were like, oh my gosh, we love your podcast. In London, not Johannesburg, London. There are people who are like, oh my gosh, we knew you were coming on this date so we could tell you to bring the books that you speak about on the podcast because they aren't available in London. So the Caine Prize was absolutely incredible because like the stories of African writers, oh, no shame, you can write. Y'all can write. I mean, it's interesting, the winning story of the Caine Prize. Oh, everyone should read it. 5 years next Sunday. Yo, that Kenyan writer.
What do you think about that notion of African literature?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about, like, African literature may have utility in Europe, in North America, right? Because it's designating where the literature is coming from. So you go to a store in, let's say, New York, and it says European literature, so you know we're talking about the Europes, right? But what I think the issue with it is, you go to a store in South Africa and they say African literature, and you're like, oh, but isn't it supposed to be all African literature because we are in Africa? And also I think the challenge for me with that is it pigeonholes what Black writers or African writers can do, right? So it's like, oh, this literature is about Africa. And I say this a lot, I say it's not about our interior lives, and that's effectively what our books are about. It's not about necessarily race, it's not necessarily about gender or sexuality, but it's about our interior lives. And for you to diminish our interior lives to say what Silo Dacre did in Hidden Stars is African literature where it could rightly be classified as sci-fi, right? So is African literature a characterization, a genre of literature, or is it a location of literature? Because oftentimes you write a nonfiction book and it's under African literature. So you write a memoir and it's under African literature. You write a novel and it's under African literature. You write a sci-fi book and it's under African literature. What are we saying? Are we saying Black writers who are from the continent, who are African, are just writing African literature? Or are we saying that they are writing sci-fi, they're writing romance novels, they're writing chick? What are we saying? So for me, I think when we begin to use it as a category, then that's where the issue is. But if we're designating it because you're in Europe and we need to know locationally where these writers are from, then it's fine. But even that is interesting because it means Africa is a country. Effectively, that's what we're saying. Because why are we not saying East African literature? Or we're saying West African literature, Southern African literature? We're just saying African literature. So when are you looking for some Senegalese writer, African literature, they don't even tell you, maybe they don't even have Senegalese writers on the bookshelf, but they just say African literature. So it's also false because it's not telling you if it's the 52 countries on the continent, which will form part of African literature, or are we saying, oh, we don't know where to put this one, so let's just put it in African literature? I used to want to say success would be, oh, we have so many followers on X, we have so many followers. And do you know what success is to me? Is that the author says this is one of the best interviews I've had about my book. There is a writer, her name is Leslie, and she wrote a book. She's been writing for 20 years. And she said at the end of our interview, this is the best interview I've had in my 20 years of writing. And that for me was success. That the people who are toiling and doing the work, they are saying this is success. Another writer in South Africa said that this is probably the most meaningful conversation I'll have about my book. And so her book are like, let's call it chicklet. So it's like one of those love story books, and people will often throw it on the wayside. But there was so much depth in that book, right, that we uncovered in our podcast, that Juanita was saying like, thank you, I'm going to take this with me. And for me, that is success. That the people who write and the people who are in conversation with have wonderful feedback and conversations. And I think also what makes it successful is the fact that we actually really love what we do. It's not for us, I wish it was a paying job, because then I could leave my paying job to just read. But it's not about the money. It's more about like, I am so glad that people want to read more because they've listened to this podcast, right? Or they've seen this virtual event. That for me is success.